is Podcast Theory.
Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to Podcast Theory Live. I am your host, Jason Sircone. It is Monday, July 15th, 2024, and I am kicking off, we'll call this a small mini-series this week, of diving in to content repurposing. And the reason why I want to spend some time with that subject this week is because I feel this is one of the, let's call it, underrated initiatives within the podcast community, and also underused. And the reason why I say that is because repurposing your content, and you know what, before I even get into my reasoning here, let's just start with the basics here. So what does repurposing mean? There, you could take that and assign a number of different definitions to it, but what I'm talking about when it comes to repurposing your content is utilizing it for everything that it can bring your way. And the beauty of podcast content is that it can be utilized across your entire digital footprint if you record it the right way. The right way is with audio and video. So I do these live streams via StreamYard. I'm obviously producing it through video, but I can also extract the audio component, and I can utilize this as an actual podcast that will go live on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, all the directories across the board. And typically the way that I do this is once I finish recording the content here in the live environment, I will then extract and edit and put that episode out shortly thereafter. So if you're not able to join me live, maybe you're hearing this on the podcast portion, it's all good. You're able to connect with me and hear this information in another way. In addition to using that part of it, I now have this video at my disposal that I can clip into smaller segments, and then I can use it on YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels, Facebook Reels. I don't use TikTok, but I could with these clips if I wanted to. In addition, I have the capability of pulling the transcript from these videos, and I can then repurpose that for a number of different things: webinars, emails, blog posts, social media posts, the framework of a book. There's so much value and impact built within these podcast recordings. And where I feel many podcasters drop the ball is they're not utilizing it for all of these purposes. Well, let me give you an example. And this is from my own experience in podcasting all these years. I think back to some of the shows I've done in the past. And what ends up happening is if you get into a good rhythm and you're batch recording, this is when I was doing my past podcast that had 2 episodes a week. It's called Evolution of Brand. When you're doing that much content per week, it makes total sense to batch record, which means that you're doing several episodes in advance. So you have a lot of content in queue that you can line up and not put yourself in a position to where you're just shotgunning off content and you have to rush something out. So I was in a position where I was a few months ahead. And honestly, getting to that point is what made me go to 2 episodes a week. And I was coming up on a major decision. Because I was so far ahead, I either had to go to 3 episodes a week or I needed to do what I felt had to be done. And that was pivot, retire that show, and go a different direction. And that was what I decided to do, because I knew if I kept moving forward, I was going to have so much content in the bank, it was going to make it even harder to make that change that I knew needed to happen. But what happens is we put all this content together and we put ourselves in a great position to where if life happens and we have to take a break, we can. And we don't have to worry about having an episode to put out this week. We can remain consistent, right? That's part of this whole equation. But what I was running into was content was recorded and then sitting in a folder for 2 months, 3 months at a time. And then when it came time to put out those episodes that week, that's when I would go in, do the editing, pull the clips, pull the content, pull the written content for social media and for newsletters and all that good stuff. But in reality, I'm only pulling a couple clips in that time frame to promote the new show that week. I could have been pulling out clips for a long time and using them to build momentum and excitement and intrigue for when this episode goes live in a couple months, and just keep constantly repeating that cycle. Not many podcasters do that, and I get it. Believe me, this week's episode is the greatest episode of all time, right? We all look at it that way. So if you're in that mode of, I've got to get this episode over this week, I've got to get this episode to catch the momentum that I need it to, and then I'll keep building on that, right? Like, that's, again, this is a lot of the thought process. So we're only focusing on what happens this week. In reality, all of the content that we're creating is valuable at all times. And sometimes we forget that, because this week we got the shiny new diamond with our new episode. But once it's live, now we got to go back to the beginning and get ready for the next one to come out. And if we're doing more than one episode a week, this is an even more, what's the word, tedious process, because we're constantly promoting what's coming next. But all that content that we have at our disposal is good across the board. And that's why podcasting is so beautiful, because as you build a catalog, you're just adding more value to what a new listener may find. And as they get invested in, let's say you're on episode 55, but they find episode 23. That may be what introduces them to your podcast. And if they fall in love and they start to get invested with what you're doing, not only are they going to start to listen to new content, they're going to take time to catch up on what they've missed. So they're going to start going through your catalog, maybe picking and choosing certain episodes, or just binging everything. That's the best case scenario. But when we don't utilize all this content, we really leave opportunity on the table. And we're constantly looking for new ways to promote ourselves, to present ourselves, to get our information in front of not just new listeners that may be discovering us for the first time, but existing listeners, existing viewers, existing members of our circle. We want to constantly be feeding them information and content that showcases that we are an expert in our space. We can be someone that can help them get the transformation that they seek. And all of this podcast content can serve those masters. But if we don't tap into all of the value that content is, all the content that is there, we miss out on some things. And we're only using a small percentage of what we have at our disposal, when in reality, we could be digging much deeper. So my message to anybody in the podcast space is to start looking at your content across the board. Start looking at everything you're creating, and don't let that content sit in a folder for a month, 2 months, 3 months. And believe me, and I'm speaking from experience. This was a mistake that I've made in the past. A lot of times when you talk to podcasters, one of the big frustrations they have is that guests don't share the episode once it goes live. And there's a number of different ways to look at that. Now, believe me, I know there are people out there utilizing podcast guesting who will just show up, sell their product, talk for a while, and leave, and you never hear from them again. To me, that's very transactional, and they're leaving opportunity for high-level networking on the table. When I'm a guest, I'm looking at relationships first. What can I do to begin cultivating a powerful relationship with the person I'm collaborating with today? The answer to that lies in the value that I bring to that podcast. I know what podcasters are trying to accomplish, and whether their goals are aligned with mine or not, the idea is to create powerful content that impacts their audience and grows their show, brings in new listeners, gives the current listeners a reason to recommend that content to others. When I come into every guest opportunity, I'm thinking like that because I want to help that podcaster accomplish that very mission. And if that aligns with the rest of their goals, excellent. But I know I'm there to provide value, tell some good stories, crack a few jokes, create something that people want to listen to. But there are some guests that don't go down that path. When new shows go live and guests don't share, many podcasters will say, why didn't they share? They were so into it when we did the recording. I figured they'd be all about sharing this with their audience, and I was banking on them getting this in front of their audience because they have a big audience. The first question I always ask is, when was the last time you spoke to that person since your recording day? And more times than not, the response is, I haven't talked to them since we recorded. Now think about that time window. And if you were as far ahead as I was, a couple months have passed. They were not just sitting idly by waiting for this podcast episode to go live. They were doing other guest appearances. They were doing their own podcast. They were doing a number of different things. Their life does not revolve around your show. So when your podcast goes live, they may not be as excited because they may have forgotten that they've even done it because they've done so many other things. Not a blanket statement, but you see my point. Communication is key. You've got to make sure that you maintain that connection, whether it's through social media, whether it's through texting, DMs, whatever. There has to be some level of communication maintained if you want that guest to remain excited. Because again, end of the day, this is not just about creating content, it's about building relationships. And if your relationships are strong, those guests are going to be a lot more excited than if things just go cold for a few months and then all of a sudden you're resurrecting the communication and saying, oh, hey, your episode's live. You better go share it or else. Many people get turned off by that. This is a big part of the whole repurposing aspect, because if you're using this content throughout the timeline of when the recording ended up until the episode goes live, but there's going to be little bits and pieces and drips and drabs that are building that intrigue within the audience, that guest is more likely to share that content throughout the whole process and stay engaged with you. That's going to put them in a much better position to actually get something from the full experience. And for you, not only does it give more content and exposure to your show, give more content to the audience and build your exposure, but it cultivates this relationship that you want to get from your podcasting efforts. There's an art and a science to this. It's not just turning on a microphone and turning on a camera and talking. These are the psychological side of things that you have to think about. But I feel if you lead with value and you think relationship first, you're going to be able to get to those end results that you're looking for a lot faster and in a lot more powerful manner, because it's going to be meaningful. And a lot of that can come from utilizing all the content that you have at your disposal, not just letting it sit on a shelf. So from the guest side, I'm going to end with this today. And I believe, like I said, I'm going to keep this series going this week throughout Podcast Theory Live. And honestly, this is something I feel might go beyond just what we're talking about this current week. If you are not utilizing the repurposing aspects of podcasting as a guest, you're also leaving opportunity on the table. Now, there are a number of people that may feel this is the wrong thing to do, and a lot of it can come down to branding, because I get that. We were just in our podcasting morning chat this morning, and this was not something I necessarily think about, because my approach is I always ask the podcaster that I'm collaborating with if they would feel comfortable sharing their video with me or the recording with me, because I would like to create my own content. And I would like to point people towards their podcast, of course, giving them credit for having me on their show, giving them more content than just what them and their team create. So there's additional exposure for everybody. And on my end of things, I'm producing content when it's fresh versus when it's just going live. And that could be, again, a month, 2 months, 3 months down the line. You have to at least ask the question. If the podcaster is comfortable with sharing that content with you, maybe they edit it first. Maybe they ask some questions about how you're going to utilize it. I get that, and that's completely fine. But you have to take those steps. For me as a podcaster, when somebody asks me that, I am always happy to provide that information because I want that additional exposure. And if I've got a guest that's willing to go to that extent, I feel I should oblige them because I want them to stay engaged in this process. And truly, if they're willing to go to that level to promote their time on my show, I want to make sure that I give them everything they need. As a guest, you have to think beyond just showing up, talking, selling, and leaving. Many guests do that. And at the end of the day, there's so much opportunity missed. For a guest, for me as a guest, I always think networking, relationship first. Again, that's what I'm going into this. I'm going to bring value. I know I'm going to tell some good stories. I want to help them create good content, but I'm always thinking about that next step. It's networking 101. When you go to a networking event, you're going to meet a lot of people. You're going to immediately start to cultivate a few good relationships, but it's up to you to take the next step. I always looked at podcasting as step one. That's my networking event. I'm going to meet somebody new. I'm going to get a chance to have a great conversation. Because I'm going on the right shows, I'm aligning with my beliefs. This is going to be a like-minded professional. We're going to have a good time putting this content together. Then for me, I take the step of, this was great. Where do we go now? Can we set up a one-to-one meeting where we don't have to record the podcast? Let's plot world domination with one another. Lots of value in that. So as a guest, you also have to think on that level. You can repurpose that content, but you build that relationship so you can get to that point. When the content goes live, when your episode goes live, more than likely the podcaster and their team are going to create a lot of assets that you can share. Make sure you're doing that. If they tag you in anything, if there's conversations around that content, be part of it. Not saying you drop everything to be as engaged as possible, but if you see something on social media and you're just in passing, don't ignore it. Make sure that you're a part of the process. Make sure that you're continuing to build that exposure, because that's why you're doing these guest appearances in the first place, right? You want to make sure that you maximize this as much as you possibly can. I love podcasting for so many reasons, but one of the big reasons is the fact that this content is so versatile and you can do so much to repurpose it and use it for so many initiatives within your brand. It's silly to not utilize it for what you can, because you're going to be doing these things anyway. Why not work smarter, not harder? So throughout this week, I'm going to share some tips and strategies about how you can use podcast content repurposed throughout different platforms, how to get the most from that, how to save yourself time, reduce your stress, ultimately eliminate some of that pod fade, eliminate some of the things that will make you burn out from doing a podcast. When you start to see this podcast production work on multiple levels, it really puts things in perspective. And it gives you so much that you can tap into. So throughout this week, I'm going to share some different things you can do to make this content come to life. And we're going to have a damn good time putting this content together. So if you're listening through the podcast, please jump over to the Bombtrack Media YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, click the bell so you know when this content is going live. Again, I'm getting closer and closer to knowing when I want to start scheduling this so I can give you exact times. And the only reason that I have not done that yet is, I apologize, I am still trying to figure out when that is going to work best for me so I don't lose consistency in communicating with you through this medium. But I promise you, it's coming. If you're watching the live stream today, thank you for being here. I hope you're subscribed. If you're not, please subscribe, click the bell. That way you'll know when I'm going live and when I drop new content here on YouTube. Please don't be a dick about this. It's a lot of fun here, and I have fun communicating with you through this medium. So with that, I'm going to sign off on today's live stream, but I'll be back tomorrow. We're going to continue talking about content repurposing. I'm going to get a little bit more specific about the different aspects that you can tap into. But until we get to that point, this has been Podcast Theory Live right here on the Bombtrack Media YouTube channel. If you're catching the replay, I'm glad to have you on board. Until our paths cross again, this has been Jason Sircone on Podcast Theory Live. Good talk. I will see you out there.